The sun hit the cracked pavement like it was punishing the ground for being poor, and the air tasted like hot dust and old secrets, the kind no one dares say out loud, but everyone knows by heart. On the surface, Oak Ridge, Alabama looked like one of those postcard towns where flags fly clean and neighbors wave with 2 fingers off a steering wheel. But if you stood still long enough, you could hear something beneath the silence. A groan, low and deep, like the earth itself was tired of pretending. That morning, the bus was late again. Or maybe it wasn't. It never stopped for her anyway. Marie stood at the corner with her back pressed against the leaning stop sign. One crutch under each arm. Her knee brace cinched so tight her skin tingled. She didn't flinch when the yellow bus came into view, didn't blink when the driver slowed just enough to meet her eyes, then stepped on the gas like she was a pothole to avoid. Inside, the kids laughed, not because it was funny, but because cruelty in Oak Ridge had rhythm, like church songs or cicadas in July. Marie adjusted her backpack, swallowing the lump in her throat like it was breakfast, and turned to walk the 4 blocks to Jefferson High alone. Each step echoed a memory, how she got the crutches, how the car hit their side of the road, and the white officer told her mama, "These things happen." They didn't. Not to them. Not unless someone let them. Behind her, the bus left a smear of black exhaust that curled in the heat like a warning. But Marie kept walking, her face like stone, because in Oak Ridge, a black girl on crutches wasn't a tragedy or a hero. She was just a reminder of everything the city refused to fix, and no one likes a reminder. No one, except the man who had just stepped off the Greyhound 2 miles away, a man whose name the town had tried to forget, and whose blood ran in Marie's veins. By the time Marie reached the school gates, the bell hadn't rung yet, but the punishment had already started. Eyes followed her like searchlights, scanning her limp, her sweat, the way her left crutch always clicked half a beat too late. A tall boy near the entrance, wearing a varsity jacket 2 sizes too big for his ego, muttered something under his breath and stuck his foot out just as she passed. She didn't fall, not this time, but the jolt twisted her knee and pulled a breath from her lungs that felt like it had knives in it. He grinned wide, all teeth and ignorance, and said, "Careful now, wouldn't want to damage government property." Laughter rippled around them. Marie stared straight ahead. Never stop, never flinch. In Oak Ridge High, black was already a sin, but black and broken, that was permission. In the hallway, the posters on the wall screamed about kindness and equality, but the lockers whispered different sermons, ones about who belonged and who didn't. She passed a group of girls with slick ponytails and eyes sharp like broken glass. One of them whispered loud enough to echo, "She walks like a drunk giraffe," and they all cracked up like it was comedy gold. Marie didn't stop. She had learned long ago that stopping gave them time to circle. Her locker was near the bathroom, where the floor was always wet, and someone had written Crip Zone in permanent marker across the top. She never reported it. The last time she tried, the guidance counselor asked her if maybe she was taking things too personally. In biology, the teacher forgot to give her the lab partner list and let her sit alone while others got into pairs. The white girl who used to be her friend before the accident, and before the accident made her blackness too visible, turned away quickly, like eye contact might be contagious. At lunch, she waited in line just long enough for the cafeteria worker to say they were out of the special meal for dietary needs, though she could see 2 left on the tray behind her. "They're for someone who called ahead," the woman said flatly, not meeting her eyes. Marie sat at the corner table, alone, where the sun hit the glass just enough to blind her, and the air conditioner never reached. That was when her crutch slipped on something under the table. Gum, maybe. Maybe spit. She didn't care anymore. The tray clattered, food sliding off the side, and again, laughter. Always laughter. Always that heat behind her eyes, and the pressure in her chest like her ribs were trying to crack. But still, she didn't cry. Not here. Not where it would feed them. Because in Oak Ridge, tears from a black girl were seen as confirmation, not evidence. And somewhere far away, in a cheap motel room with peeling wallpaper and a gun on the nightstand, the man who had stepped off the Greyhound was watching the town map, circling names. One of them had been crossed out already. The 3rd time Marie tried to take bus 9, it was raining, the kind of slow, heavy southern rain that soaked through your clothes before you even realized it started. Her backpack clung to her back like a second spine, and the rubber tips of her crutches slipped on the wet concrete with every step. But still, she stood at the corner, waiting like she always did. The bus turned the block, its headlights dull behind the mist, and for a moment she let herself believe, just for a second, that maybe today would be different. It wasn't. The bus slowed, just enough to make her heart rise, just enough to tease the idea of mercy. Then the driver saw her, squinted like he had something sour in his eye, and mashed the gas. The tires hissed as the bus rolled past her, close enough to spray cold gutter water across her legs, soaking the bottom of her jeans and making her slip just slightly. No one inside looked at her. Not really. One kid, a freshman she'd seen in the cafeteria once, caught her gaze through the window, then turned away fast like looking too long would brand him. Inside, the seats were filled. White kids in warm hoodies, dry shoes, laughter muffled by fogged windows. Marie watched until the taillights disappeared behind the trees. Her legs ached, her hands blistered beneath the grips of her crutches, but she turned and began walking. Again. Her shoes squished with every step. That night, she told her mother what happened. Her mother wiped her hands on a dish towel, stared at the floor and said, "Baby, sometimes it's just how it is." Marie wanted to scream, to ask why it was always just how it is for them, but she didn't, because her mother's voice wasn't tired. It was broken. At school, they had started calling her Ghost Rider, a joke about how she haunted the bus stop and never got on. Someone even made a meme of her and passed it around in group chats she wasn't invited to. Her crutches became symbols of weakness, not courage. Her silence, a reason to push further. She found her name carved into the side of her locker, next to a drawing of a monkey holding a crutch. When she showed it to the janitor, he shrugged. "Kids are cruel," he said, and kept sweeping. The driver of Bus 9 was named Carl Dunley. He'd driven for 23 years, never had a complaint stick. He'd once told another driver, "There are two kinds of riders, those who belong and those who beg." And to him, Marie wasn't even begging. She was just in the way. He joked about her sometimes during smoke breaks, called her Miss Hopalong Harriet and Chocolate Crutch. No one stopped him. No one ever did. But a photo of him had recently landed on a corkboard in that same motel room, pinned beside a copy of the bus route and a school map. A red circle was drawn around his face. Thick, unforgiving, permanent. Let's take a short pause. If you're still with us, let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from? Have you ever gone through something similar, something that made you feel invisible or pushed aside? Share your story. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Now, we continue. The sound of her crutches echoed through the hall like an accusation no one wanted to answer. Tick, 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 tick. A rhythm she never chose, but now carried like a curse. And every time Marie moved, it reminded them she was still here. Still black, still broken, still breathing, where they believed she shouldn't. It wasn't just the students anymore. Even the teachers had mastered the art of invisible cruelty. In gym class, Coach Daniels told her she could sit on the bench, then laughed in front of the others. "She's already got 2 extra legs. She don't need to run." The class roared. No one stood up, not even the ones who looked guilty. That's how it worked. Guilt in Oak Ridge was private, shame was public, and silence was safety. During a history presentation, she was the only one asked to speak about slavery, as if her bloodline made her qualified. When she said she didn't want to, the teacher smiled tight and said, "It's important for you to engage with your heritage." Her voice cracked when she refused again, and from the back, someone whispered, "She's too lazy to even talk about being a slave." Laughter again, always laughter, like a choir of knives. Marie barely made it through the day. The bathrooms were off limits unless she wanted to be followed by 2 girls who waited for her to lock the stall before they banged on the door, called her Crip Witch, and threw wet paper towels over the side. The janitor never seemed to be nearby when it happened. In the library, the librarian reminded her that the disabled desk was only for short use, even though it was the only one she could reach without pain. At lunch, someone had replaced her fruit cup with one filled with gravel and stuck a note inside that said, "Since you like to chew pain." She didn't report it. What was the point? Her mum worked double shifts just to keep the lights on, and the school called too often with behavioural concerns already. Marie didn't need more trouble, but that night, while she lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow like a countdown, a thought slid into her mind. Cold, quiet, steady. Maybe this was all she'd ever be. A moving target, a cracked outline of a girl. Her leg throbbed, her chest felt hollow. And across town, inside the cheap motel where the wallpaper curled like dried skin, the man with her blood was marking the days. He listened to the tapes he'd made, the ones where she cried quietly after school, her voice just barely caught by the recorder he'd hidden in the bus stop pole weeks earlier. He'd known. He always knew. But now he had evidence. Names. Faces. Voices. The crutches weren't the only thing she was forced to carry. They said he was dead, erased by time and rumour. But no grave bore his name, and no tombstone marked his passing. 2 nights ago, a battered greyhound rolled into Oak Ridge under a rain of neon streetlights and carried off the driver who refused Marie a seat. And in that same bus terminal, in the slow hours before dawn, he stepped onto the cracked pavement, wearing a coat older than most buildings in this town. His eyes as cold and deep as the river, where they said he'd died fighting men with guns and badges. And now here he was, bending his weight into a single cane like a general, regaining strength after a long battle. A man who smelled of whiskey and tobacco and desperation. Of history too heavy for any man to carry. No one recognized him at first. Oak Ridge likes its heroes shiny and its villains clean-cut, but he had neither polish nor simplicity. His hands were scarred from something darker than war, something whispered about in closed rooms, something that spoke in screams. Marie watched him out of the corner of her eye as she limped past the bus stop on her way home, her crutches rattling accusations at anyone who dared stare. He stood by the crumbling brick wall that once held a mural proclaiming unity and brotherhood. Now peeling paint and rusted rivets testified to broken promises, and when he saw her glance, he straightened like a soldier called back to duty. Her heart thudded in her chest, louder than the bus engine echoing down Main Street. She knew that face not from pictures, but from stories. Stories her mother refused to tell. Stories her grandmother had sung in lullabies stained with tears. They said he'd attacked the sheriff's office when they came for him, that he'd taken on men twice his size with nothing but his bare fists and a fury that was heard as far as Montgomery. They said he'd been shot 5 times, left for dead in a ditch where the vultures circled. But Oak Ridge buried the truth deeper than bones. Nobody here remembered because remembering hurt too much. That evening, Marie limped up to the yard behind her trailer, where her mother hung laundry like flags of surrender. The two looked at each other, daughter and mother, broken mirror images, and Marie whispered, "There's a man outside. He knows me." Her mother's hands stilled on a damp shirt. Her eyes flickered with something like fear, or relief, or both. But the next moment she shook her head and said, "It can't be." Still, the next morning Marie found a photograph slipped. Beneath her door, a black and white shot of her grandfather standing tall and wide-shouldered, arms crossed against an invisible enemy, eyes burning with a hatred no child should ever witness. On the back, someone had scrawled, "Remember who you are." At school, the corridors had never felt colder. Teachers faltered when she passed. Students glanced away quickly, as if her bloodline might stain them by proximity. Locker doors slammed shut in silent warning. Someone tugged at her crutch handle as she walked past. She whipped around and saw a lean teenager with eyes like dead leaves whispering, "Your grandpa got what he deserved," and every syllable cut deeper than any blade. Marie's breath caught. She gripped her cane tighter and squeezed until her knuckles blazed. Then she did something she'd never dared. She spat in his face, hard and wet, and the hall went silent, a vacuum drawing in every breath. He wiped his cheek, stunned, and she limped away without a backward glance. Later, she found him waiting by the bus stop again, leaning his cane and staring at her like a king with a plan. No words passed between them at first, no apologies, no explanations. He just nodded once, a slow motion that spoke of grudges carried through lifetimes. Then he opened his mouth, and his voice was gravel and silk, a combination that made her shoelaces feel tight in their loops. They think I died so they could forget me. They think you're alone so they can break you." He paused, knuckles white on the knob of his cane. "They're wrong." That night, the town slept under a blanket of complacency, but Marie lay awake thinking of the rides she'd missed, the names she'd been called, the weight of every laugh thrown at her like stones. She pictured her grandfather in a motel room with peeling wallpaper and a map of streets and bus routes pinned above the bed, each red X marking a crime he planned to right. He was hunting names now, gathering evidence. Photos taken through fogged glass, recordings clipped from hidden mics, witness statements pressed into envelopes. The next morning, as the sun smothered everything in pale yellow light, Marie found a scrap of paper in her locker. On it was her name, written neat as a tombstone, and beneath it, "Tonight, 10 p.m. No crutches. Be ready." Her heart pounded so loud she thought the other students must hear it. They didn't look up. They never look. She knew what it meant. Tonight she had to face the bus driver who spat at her dignity, the coach who sat her out like she was an obstacle, the librarian who locked out her needs. But to face them, she would have to be unarmed, without crutches, vulnerable in ways she had practiced running from every single day. Marie slipped the paper into her pocket and ran her thumb over the edges. She thought of her grandfather's eyes, how they'd burned with a promise of reckoning. She thought of the town that smiled on some and spat on others, and she thought of the night ahead, her body aching, her spirit trembling, but her blood pulsing with a fire she'd never known she carried. Tonight would be different, because the man they called a ghost had come back to prove that some things never die, and Marie, broken only by their design, was ready to rise. The air was thick with moisture when Marie finally left her house that night. The sky was swollen with storm clouds that seemed to carry every bad omen ever whispered about Oak Ridge, and the ground beneath her feet was soft, the damp earth sinking under the weight of every step she took. She hadn't told her mother where she was going, and that alone made her heart pound with guilt, but her mother had enough ghosts in her past to fill a room and more. Marie knew she would say nothing. No one would question why she'd left. No one would stop her either. The truth was, she was walking to something she had never fully understood until now, something that had followed her through her whole life, buried deep inside her, waiting for the moment when she would finally be strong enough to dig it out. The streetlights flickered as she moved through the abandoned streets, shadows growing long in the oppressive night. Her crutches clicked against the wet pavement like the ticking of a clock, marking every moment, every breath, as she passed the houses where the lights were still on, where families were sitting down to dinner, completely unaware of the storm, brewing just outside their doors. She could hear the whispers as she walked past them, the silent mockery, the "there goes the crippled girl," the looks that slid off her like oil on water. She had become so used to it that it felt like she was part of the air, part of the pavement, like she wasn't even human. Her chest ached with the weight of it all, and yet she didn't stop. The farther she went, the heavier the night became, the more the world seemed to shrink around her. The streets that once seemed familiar now felt like a maze, and the darkness in the corners of each house seemed to follow her every step. When she reached the old gas station by the edge of town, the one that had been abandoned for years, she saw him standing there, waiting. Her grandfather. She had only seen him in old photographs, his face drawn hard with anger and determination. But now he was real, standing in the dim light, his cane in one hand, and his eyes fixed on her, like they were the only two people left in the world. His face was scarred with age and bitterness, the lines of his past etched deep into his skin. But it was his eyes that held her, eyes that had seen more than she could ever imagine, eyes that had fought battles that no one could understand. He stepped forward slowly, his movements measured but sure. "You're here," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You're ready." Marie didn't know if she was ready, but she nodded. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, the words feeling like they weighed a ton. "I don't know how to fight this." Her grandfather's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile that comes from years of understanding the ugliest parts of humanity. "You don't have to know how to fight it, girl," he said, his voice as cold as steel. "You just have to be willing to make them see you, make them remember you, They'll never forget you once they see who you really are. He motioned to the darkness behind him. Come with me. Marie hesitated for a moment, then followed him into the shadows. They walked in silence, the sound of her crutches and his cane tapping against the pavement the only noise between them. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches of the trees that lined the street, and the air smelled like rain, like something was about to break open. As they turned the corner and passed the old church, Marie saw a group of people gathered near the gas station, the people who had always looked at her like she didn't belong, like she was something to be pitied, or worse, ignored. They didn't see her as a person. They saw her as a broken thing, something less than human. But tonight would be different. Her grandfather stopped in front of the crowd, and Marie stood beside him, feeling the weight of their gaze on her. She could hear their murmurs, the whispers that followed her everywhere. What's she doing here? One of the boys from school sneered. What's she think she's gonna do? Another laughed, his voice dripping with mockery. Look at her, trying to act like she's somebody. Marie didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She stood tall as she could with the crutches under her arms, her head held high. I'm somebody, she said, her voice louder than she intended but strong. And I'm not going anywhere. Her grandfather nodded approvingly, his eyes sweeping over the crowd with the calm of someone who had seen enough of this town's ugliness to know it was all just noise. You hear that? He asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. You hear what she said? He stepped forward, pushing the crowd back with nothing more than his presence. You've all spent your lives hiding behind walls, behind your ignorance, behind your silence. You've built a town that's nothing more than a house of mirrors, where everyone's reflection is distorted to make them feel better about themselves. But tonight, that stops. He turned to Marie, and for the first time, she saw something like pride in his eyes. Tonight, you are going to make them see you, make them remember you. And with that, he turned and walked away, his cane clicking against the pavement, leaving Marie standing alone in front of the crowd. The silence was deafening. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like 1,000 hands. But she stood there, unmoving, because for the first time in her life, she didn't care what they thought. She didn't care if they laughed or mocked her. She was done being invisible, done being their joke, done being their afterthought. She was going to make them see her, make them see the girl they had tried to erase. She could hear her grandfather's voice in the back of her mind. You just have to be willing to make them see you. The first stone came flying from the back of the crowd. It wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. But Marie didn't flinch. She stood her ground. The second stone hit her shoulder, sending a sharp pain through her body, but still, she didn't move. She stood taller. The crowd grew louder, their voices rising in a chorus of mockery, but Marie didn't hear them. She only heard the steady beat of her own heart, the steady rhythm of her crutches tapping on the ground beneath her. She was here. She was visible. She was not invisible. Not anymore. And when the third stone came, it hit her square in the chest. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but it didn't break her. She looked up at the crowd, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Is that all you've got? She shouted, her voice loud and clear. Is that all you can do? Throw stones and laugh? The crowd fell silent. For the first time in her life, they were listening. They were seeing her. And that was all she needed. Marie sat at the edge of the cracked sidewalk long after the last bus had rumbled by, the night air thick with the scent of petrol and threat, every distant honk and rumble echoing like a promise of pain. And when Bus 9 finally appeared, ghostly, headlights piercing the darkness, she swung her crutches forward without hesitation, planting them firmly as if staking claim to the world itself. The driver, Carl Dunley, recognized her immediately, his eyes narrowing into slits as he rolled down the window and barked, "Not tonight, cripple." But Marie only tilted her chin up, her voice crisp through the night. "Tonight I ride," and gripped, her crutches harder, her determination burning hotter than the street lamps. She climbed aboard, each movement deliberate, startling the few late-night riders who shivered in their seats when the driver slammed the door shut behind her. Inside, the bus smelled of stale sweat and superiority. A group of white teenagers at the back poked her rib with a swollen shoe and whispered, "Look at that ghetto princess acting like she belongs here." Laughter rippling until it was almost deafening. Marie's heart pounded, her knuckles whitening on the crutch handles. But she walked down the aisle without flinching, her gaze locked on the driver's rearview mirror, where Carl's face twisted into a sneer. When she reached the front, he tried to close the door, but she slid an instant too quick, blocking it, and demanded in a voice that brooked no argument, "Your policy says empty seats first. Which one's mine?" He spat on the floor, the saliva sizzling like contempt, and shouted, "We don't have room for freaks like you." But the bus jolted forward anyway, carrying them all into the unknown. As the bus lurched through empty streets, the passengers' insults ricocheted off the windows. "Can't you see she's broken? What's she even doing here?" a woman muttered, her eyes averting like Marie's mere presence was contagious. A man seized a crutch mid-aisle, waving it like a baton, calling her cripwitch, and daring her to stop him. Marie watched, silent fury coiling in her chest, remembering every insult carved into her locker, every whispered joke she wasn't allowed to laugh at. Her seat, a single vacant spot by the back window, was pinched between two men who leaned in, voices low and venomous. "Bet she's used to being on the ground," one hissed, "like the nigger in the movies." And the other spat the word so casually that Marie felt it carve a hollow in her ribs. She slid into the seat, her crutches clicking on the vinyl floor, and fixed the window latch, her breaths long and steady as the bus rattled on. The engine hummed a tune of inevitability as they passed through the skeletal downtown, where shuttered stores bore graffiti that read, "White Pride" and "Go Home, Beaner," as if hatred were a second language everyone spoke. The bus lights flickered, making shadows dance across faces twisted in contempt, and Marie's heart thrummed louder than the engine, adrenaline fanning her spine. Then the bus hit a pothole so deep it threw her crutches askew and cracked the floorboards, causing a metallic shriek that silenced the riders for a breathless moment. Carl cursed and braked hard, sending the whole vehicle into a judder that rattled nerves and teeth. Everyone lurched forward, curses flying, and one of the men cursed Marie for breaking the damn bus. But she ignored them, swung her crutches back into place, and stood, every nerve on fire, as the driver's door opened with a pop of cold night. He barked, "Get off!" But Marie planted her feet, her voice low and unwavering. "I paid for my ticket." He laughed, a hollow sound that tasted of fear, and waved a hand. "You ain't paid nothing here." With that, she raised her voice, clear and unwavering. "I'm here until you admit what you did, until you say my name without disgust, or you drive this bus straight to the station and let me off where I deserve." The silence that followed was heavier than the steel of the bus itself. No one moved. Her eyes swept over each rider, recalculating their complicity. And around her the bus felt smaller, like a confession booth where every sin would be exposed. Carl's face tightened, hatred and shock mingling in his glare, and he slumped back into his seat, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The bus resumed its tremulous journey, but at least for that moment, Marie had won. As the miles slipped by under the tired tires, the crowd began to unravel. A teenage girl unzipped her hoodie, revealing a sweatshirt scrawled with a Confederate flag, and when she saw Marie watching, she ripped it off and demanded Carl pull over so she could be let off. Others shifted in their seats, refusing to meet Marie's eyes, uncertainty replacing arrogance. It was as though Marie's presence exposed the rot in their hearts, and they couldn't bear the mirror. 2 stops later, the bus slowed at the edge of town where streetlights petered out into darkness, and Carl announced, "Everybody off," voice flat as though reading from a script. One by one, they filed past Marie, shoulders hunched, faces pale where moments ago they had been flushed with contempt. She watched them go, her chest hollow but her spirit rising, until only she and Carl remained. His knuckles rapped on the glass divider. "Get off," he said. Marie met his gaze for a long moment, then shook her head, metal crutches clicking as she planted herself firmer. "This is my stop," she said, "and I'm not leaving." He stood up, stepped out of his cab, and slammed the door so hard the glass shivered. The engine died. Silence roared. Then he came down the aisle, each footstep a judge's gavel, and shoved Marie's crutches aside so she crashed to the floor, the impact stealing her breath. Before she could scramble up, He kneed the crutches into the aisle and cursed, "Get out, or I'll drag you." Marie pressed her palms against the seat legs, filled her lungs and yelled, "No!" Her voice a thunderclap through the hush. The other riders at the window, drawn by her cry, helped her to her feet, their eyes ringing with shame. One by one, they stepped forward and reclaimed her crutches from the floor. A lanky teenager lifted them high and said, "Let her ride," and the others echoed it like a hymn. "Let her ride, let her ride." Carl froze, his face a canvas of betrayal, and slowly retreated up the aisle, collapsing into his seat with trembling hands on the wheel. For a heartbeat, nothing moved but the bus, rolling forward again into the night, carrying Marie and her unwanted companions back toward the bright lie of Oak Ridge. She sat in her seat, heart hammering, the circling headlights carving patterns on her face, and realized something so simple it felt like a revelation. They feared her because she refused to be silent, because she refused to shrink. In that moment, the bus was no longer a prison but a vessel, and she was its captain. And as they neared the terminal, she stood and faced the interior, her crutches raised high like twin banners, and shouted, "I belong here!" The echo of her voice chased them off the bus, leaving her alone in the driver's seat where she dropped the crutches and touched the cold steel steering column, tasting the power in her fingertips. She closed her eyes, breathed in the hum of the engine, and whispered, "Next stop, Reckoning," before pulling away into the long stretch of midnight road, her silhouette a promise no one in Oak Ridge would ever forget. The sun was setting over Oak Ridge like a bruise on the horizon, the sky turning from orange to purple, and in that light, everything seemed more real than it ever had been before. Marie sat at the edge of the bus station parking lot, her crutches propped up beside her, watching as the streetlights flickered to life one by one. She'd come here every night since that ride, but each night felt like it had a different weight to it. Some nights, the air was thick with anticipation, others heavy with the scent of failure. But tonight was different. Tonight, she could feel it in her bones, a tension that hummed in the air, a pressure building, pushing everything toward a breaking point. Oak Ridge wasn't a town that was used to fighting back. It wasn't a place where people stood up and said enough was enough, but it was about to be, and it was going to be because of her, because she refused to be invisible. Marie had become something of a ghost in Oak Ridge, a shadow in a town that wasn't ready to acknowledge the parts of itself that it had buried. The kids at school still whispered behind her back, still made jokes about her crutches, still told their parents that she was just a broken girl who would never amount to anything. But those whispers were starting to die down, and the looks that followed her through the hallways were beginning to change. She saw them now, those looks of uncertainty, those glances that lingered just a second too long, the eyes that seemed to question if they were wrong about her all along. And for the first time in her life, she realized they were afraid of her strength, afraid of the things she had survived, afraid of what might happen if she decided to fight back. The bus station was empty now, the last few passengers from the evening rush trickling off into the darkness. But Marie stayed, her back against the brick wall, her mind racing with everything that had happened. The names, the jokes, the mocking. It had all led her here. And now she was ready to show them. To show Oak Ridge that she wasn't the thing they laughed at. She was the thing they feared. The thing that had been lying in wait all these years, watching, listening, learning, until finally, it was time to rise. She didn't see him at first, but she felt him. The presence of a shadow just at the edge of her vision. A figure in the dark who had been following her for days now, lurking just out of sight. She turned slowly, her crutches clicking lightly against the pavement as she straightened herself, her heart thumping in her chest. There, standing in the fading light, was a man she didn't recognize. Tall, dressed in a worn leather jacket that looked like it had been through too many battles to count. His eyes were dark, piercing, and there was something about him that made Marie feel both uneasy and, strangely, safe. "You're the girl," he said, his voice low, but not unkind. Marie didn't speak at first. She studied him carefully, sizing him up in the silence that stretched between them. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a teacher or a classmate, but there was something familiar about him. Something about the way he carried himself, like he knew things that most people in Oak Ridge didn't. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice steady despite the unfamiliar chill creeping up her spine. "The name's Victor," he said, taking a step forward. "But that's not important right now. What matters is what you're about to do. You think this town's ready for it?" Marie didn't answer at first. She knew what he was talking about, the quiet tension that had been building for weeks. The way the town seemed to be holding its breath as if waiting for something terrible to happen. But what that something was, she wasn't sure yet. "I think it's ready for the truth," Marie said, her voice firm, unwavering. Victor gave a half smile, a flash of something almost predatory in his eyes. "Truth, huh? You think that'll be enough?" "I don't need truth. I need people to see me," she said, her hands tightening around the grips of her crutches. "I need them to see what they've been doing to me, and to everyone like me, for years." Victor nodded, the smile fading. "You think they'll listen?" "I don't care if they listen," Marie said, her eyes hardening. "I care if they remember." Victor's gaze softened just a fraction. "Then you're already halfway there." He took a long breath, his gaze sweeping over the parking lot, the empty buses, the town beyond it. "I've been watching you, girl. Watching the way they treat you. Watching the way you've been taking it. You've got fire in you, but fire's dangerous if you don't know how to control it." Marie straightened, her chin lifted defiantly. "I've spent my whole life being controlled. Not anymore." Victor studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. Finally, he stepped back, and for the first time, the tension in his body seemed to relax just a bit. "All right, we do this on your terms, but you need to understand something." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. "There's no going back once you start. Oak Ridge won't be the same after tonight, and neither will you." Marie didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." "Good," he said, his tone serious now. "Then let's go." They walked in silence, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the empty pavement, the distant hum of the town's few remaining cars far off in the night. Marie's mind was racing, her thoughts like a storm. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew it had to happen. It was the only way to stop the suffocating weight of what this town had turned her into. A victim, a joke, a shadow. And tonight, she would make sure no one would ever see her that way again. They reached the edge of town, the streetlights flickering as if in warning, and Victor stopped in front of an old warehouse, its windows boarded up, its door rusted with age. Marie felt the familiar surge of fear, but she ignored it. Fear had no place here, not anymore. "This is where it starts," Victor said. "You ready to make them listen?" Marie nodded without a word. She had nothing to say anymore, nothing to hold her back. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Victor pushed open the door, the creak of the hinges like a warning. Inside, the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of streetlights outside. But there, standing in the center of the room, was a group of people. People who had been waiting for her. They were the ones who had watched the town, the ones who had seen what had happened to Marie and countless others. And now, they were ready to act. One of them stepped forward, a woman with a scar running down her cheek, her eyes fierce and unyielding. She looked at Marie with a steady gaze and said, "We've been waiting for you." Marie didn't respond. She didn't need to. She was done with words. She was done waiting. They were going to make Oak Ridge see. They were going to make them remember. And when it was over, they would never look at her the same way again. The night felt alive with menace as Marie stepped onto the abandoned trolley tracks that cut through the industrial quarter, her crutches clicking ominously against the steel rails, each echo a herald of reckoning. And behind her, the ragged silhouettes of her allies emerged from shadow. Victor's scarred recruit with the knife-etched scars on her forearm, the librarian who'd resigned rather than enforce ableist rules, the janitor's son who'd secretly recorded every insult flung at Marie in exchange for a promise of justice. And together they moved like ghosts toward the old switchyard, where rusted carts lay half-buried in weeds and broken dreams. Above them, the night wind carried distant jeers from the last patrons of O'Malley's Dive, where the bus driver Carl Dunley and his cronies nursed whiskey and hatred in equal measure, sharpening their tongues against the grain of oak tables. Marie's heart thundered, not with fear, but with purpose, as she glanced at her grandfather's upright figure at the head of their motley cadre, his pale eyes burning brighter than any street lamp, and he raised a gloved hand in signal as they reached the first cart, where someone had stenciled in black paint the mocking phrase, "Darky Lane Stop," alongside a crudely drawn swastika. The words dripped in fresh paint, the sting of humiliation vivid under her skin even now, but she closed her eyes for a moment and remembered every lash of contempt, every whispered slur, nigger, monkey, cripwitch, tucked into the margins of her life, until they all formed a ledger of cruelty she intended to balance in blood. At her grandfather's nod, they split, Victor leading two toward the trolley shed at the far end, where they would trap the driver when he came to investigate, while Marie and the rest approached the siding nearest the bar. The hiss of an opening door told them Carl had arrived early, annoyance etched into every wrinkle of his face as he stomped across gravel toward the tracks, muttering about trespassers and liability, unaware of the inevitability that awaited him. He stepped onto the rails, flashlight bobbing in his hand, and cast the beam over the splintered ties until it landed on Marie's silhouette. Crutches splayed at her side like twin stakes, and he sneered, "Back again, freak. Can't quit us, can you?" His cronies' laughter crashed behind him, echoing off the corrugated walls. But Marie didn't flinch. She moved forward until his light hit her face in full, illuminating the stark determination there. And in that moment, he saw not a crippled girl, but something altogether different. An avenger clad in the skin of innocence. "I rode your bus," she said quietly, voice carrying as if amplified by the steel beams overhead. "I sat in your seat. I stood before your passengers. You spat in my tray. You forced me off your route. You made me invisible and less than human. But tonight, you won't ignore me." He raised a hand, fist clenched, and strode toward her. But as he came within striking distance, Victor's partner lunged from the shadows, pressing a gun to his temple with a soft click that silenced the night. The beam from Carl's flashlight danced over the barrel and back onto Marie's unblinking eyes, and for the first time, terror cracked through his bravado. Behind him, the recruits fanned out, corralling the 3 white men and 2 women who cheered as Marie fell at the cafeterial tables, who had the gall to demand, "Why can't you just be normal?" and "Why do you insist on complaining?" Their faces drained of colour as they realised the hunter had become the hunted. Marie's grandfather stepped forward, cane raised but never swinging, and spoke in a voice so low it seemed to rumble in the ground beneath them. "Your ledger is open." Each word landed like a verdict. They formed a semicircle around Carl, whose hands shook enough that the gun at his head wobbled uncertainly, and Marie advanced until she stood close enough to see the sweat beading on his lips. "You erased me from your route," she said. "You erased my dignity. You erased my rights. But none of that erased the blood in my veins or the fire in my heart. Now you'll be the first name in my book." She reached into her pocket and drew out a small leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked, its pages yellowed. With her crutch, she tapped it twice, and Victor's partner slid the barrel away, pressing it instead against the chest of the man who'd once cracked her skull with a rival's fist in gym class, the bench where she was forced to sit. "Your name goes here first," Marie said, opening the book to the blank page at the front. She looked to the recruit standing behind her, nodding once, almost imperceptibly, and he reached down to pull the guy's wallet from his back pocket, flipping it open to the ID. The hush was absolute. The only sound the distant rumble of traffic and the ragged breathing of the condemned. The recruiter snapped a photo of the ID with his phone, then handed it to Marie, who carefully printed the man's full name in spidery script. Beneath it, she wrote, "For every taunt, every shove, every insult, this debt is owed." She closed the book with finality, her fingers brushing the leather, and passed the notebook to her grandfather. Carl's sobs began soft and high, the beginnings of brokenness, but she didn't look back. Instead, she turned to the rest of her targets, the coach who laughed at her in the gym, the librarian who barred her from her desk, the girls who teased her at the bus stop. Each was collared and forced to present ID. Each got their name added in ink that would never fade. When the tally reached 6, Marie lifted her head and spoke the unspoken. This was only the beginning. Then Victor's group drifted back, guiding their captives toward the trolley shed, where they would be locked in side rooms long enough to teach them something about helplessness, about fear, about rage unbound. Marie's grandfather watched this with hawk eyes, then passed the notebook back to the girl. "One more," he said softly. Marie nodded and turned once more to Carl. The driver's face was wet with fear, mascara and tears streaking, shame etched into every pore. She stepped in close enough to feel his breath, and whispered, "Your name," then drew the final line herself, a flourish of vengeance. The notebook snapped shut, a sentence complete. Behind her, the recruits had gathered their phones and evidence, ready to send photos and recordings to every news outlet, daring enough to cover a story of vigilante justice in a town that never saw what it did to its weakest. Marie raised her crutch overhead and forged a small cross in the air, a symbol of her survival over their hate, and in that motion, the circle broke. The captives were led off to face public humiliation and the long climb back from debt to dignity, while Marie's grandfather locked the shed doors with a padlock, whose key he dropped into the weeds to rust away. As the group dispersed into the night, each bound for home or hospital or jail, Marie stood alone in the center of the tracks, her crutches planted like twin flags of conquest, and for the first time, Oakridge felt silent. The wind carried away the last echoes of their cries for mercy, and in that hush she heard something she'd never heard before. The steady beat of her own heart, unbroken, unashamed, unafraid. The ledger lay closed in her pack, heavy with names and debts, but in her chest lay a fire that no amount of hatred could ever extinguish. And as she limped down the track toward the faint glow of dawn on the outskirts of town, she knew that no matter how many names they tried to erase, none of them could ever erase her. The sun hadn't quite risen over Oakridge, but its faint glow bled into the sky, washing the town in a bruised shade of pink and orange that seemed to mock the darkness of the night that had just passed. The streets, still damp from the mist that hung like a veil over the town, were silent in the early morning hours. But inside the houses, behind the drawn curtains, things had already started to change. Marie's heart beat with a rhythm she didn't recognize. There was a weight to it now, heavier than before, as if the world had shifted on its axis and she was standing in the aftermath, alone, but not alone. Alone in the sense that she could no longer walk back into the life she had once known, but not alone in the sense that her spirit had been tempered in ways she'd never thought possible. Last night, something had broken. Not in her, but in the town. The faces of those who had been complicit in her suffering now haunted her thoughts. She had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed, but there was no turning back. Not after everything they'd done. She had become the reckoning, and now the weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders. There was no going back to the girl who had silently suffered, the girl who had let the whispers slide off her skin like water. That girl was gone, and the girl who stood at the edge of Oakridge now had a fire in her eyes that burned as hot as the sun rising in the distance. She stood at the foot of the hill overlooking the town, the crutches resting in the wet grass, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts as she took in the sight of Oakridge, a place that had tried to break her so many times. She had not only survived, but now she was part of something that could never be erased. The news had spread quickly, the pictures, the recordings, the names. It had all been sent to the local news stations, shared in whispers and loudmouth gossip, until the truth had erupted into the public. What had once been hidden beneath layers of hate and ignorance was now exposed for all to see, and the world was watching. Oakridge, with all its prejudices and deep-seated hatred, was now a town divided. It wasn't just the people Marie had confronted. It was the entire fabric of the place that was beginning to tear at the seams. People didn't know what to say, what to do. The townspeople who had once turned a blind eye to the cruelty happening under their noses now found themselves face to face with the ugly truth of who they were. They couldn't escape it. They couldn't ignore it anymore. And for some, the truth was more than they could bear. Marie walked back toward the town, each step heavier than the last. The crutches clicked against the pavement in a rhythmic, almost soothing sound, but her thoughts were anything but peaceful. She had done what she set out to do, what she had to do, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger, and that terrified her. The town might never forgive her for what she had done. The town might never forgive anyone who had helped her. The marks they had all left would never fully fade, even if they tried to pretend like nothing had happened. The damage had been done, and now all she could do was wait for the fallout. As she entered the streets, the once familiar roads seemed foreign to her. The houses, the faces, the cars all seemed like reminders of the life she had lost, the life she would never return to, the life she had once believed in, before she knew how deeply hatred and racism were woven into the very fabric of this place, before she had learned what it truly meant to be invisible. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, glancing at the message that had just appeared on her screen. It was from her mother. "Where are you? Please come home. I'm worried." Marie paused, her finger hovering over the screen, uncertain of how to respond. Her mother had been through enough. She had suffered enough, and now here Marie was, dragging her into something even bigger than herself, something that could tear their lives apart for good. But the truth was, Marie had already made her choice. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She wasn't going to keep pretending that everything was fine, not when she had seen firsthand the kind of darkness that lived beneath Oakridge's pretty surface, not when she had faced it, looked it in the eye, and survived. There was no going back to silence. She typed a response. "I'm coming home, but things will be different now. We have to talk about everything." She hit send, staring at the phone in her hands for a moment longer than she should have. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew the storm that would follow, the pain and anger that would rise in her mother's eyes, in her own heart. But this was the only way forward. There was no other way. As she walked down the street toward her mother's house, she could see the windows of the other homes opening, people peering out from behind the curtains, watching her every step. They knew who she was. They knew what she had done. They couldn't ignore it anymore. And even though they may have hated her for it, even though they would never forgive her for making them face the truth, they couldn't deny her anymore. Marie reached her house and opened the door slowly. Her mother was sitting at the kitchen table, her face drawn with worry. But there was a certain quiet determination in her eyes that Marie had never seen before. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at Marie with a mixture of fear and love. "I did what I had to do," Marie said softly, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. Her mother didn't respond right away. She just nodded, the weight of the situation sinking in. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "I know you did, but I don't know what's going to happen now. You've set something in motion, Marie. You've brought down a storm." Marie sat down across from her mother, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. "I know. But the storm was already here, Mama. We just never looked at it until it was too late." Her mother nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "And now?" "And now," Marie said, taking a deep breath, "we rebuild. We make them remember what they did. We make them face it." They sat there together in the silence, the soft tick of the clock on the wall the only sound. The storm outside had passed, but Marie knew that the real storm, the one inside Oakridge, the one inside people's hearts, was just beginning. But she was ready for it, ready for the reckoning that would follow, ready for the fight, because now they couldn't hide from her anymore. The echoes of her crutches were no longer just a reminder of her disability. They were the sound of defiance, of strength, of a girl who had been broken but refused to stay that way. The crutches clicked against the pavement once more, and in that sound, Marie knew she had started something. She had begun to rewrite the story of Oakridge, and in the end, the truth, no matter how painful, would always rise. The reckoning was just beginning. And for the first time in her life, Marie wasn't afraid of it. We'd love to hear what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life or witnessed it? Your thoughts are incredibly important to us, and we value each and every one of you. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It really helps us out. We hope you have a wonderful day ahead. And if you've listened all the way through, let us know in the comments by writing "I see you" to show us you were here until the very end. Your support means the world.